Good morning, everyone. We are just going to give it a moment for everyone to join, and then we will get started. All right, it's slowing down a little bit, so I will go ahead and get started. Good morning again, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Safety Planning Amidst a Housing Crisis in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We are thrilled to have Sydney Carter and Jaclyn Hough from Reach Beyond Domestic Violence here to present this training today. My name is Charlotte Hough. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Communications and Training Specialist here at MOVA. I'm just going to go over some logistics quickly before passing it over to our presenters. First of all, this is a Zoom webinar, so you cannot be seen or heard as audience members, but you can see the presenters, ASL interpreters, and presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of the Zoom screen to ask them. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. As I mentioned, we do have ASL interpretation and CART captioning available during today's session. To see the closed captions, go to the bottom of the screen. Click on the up arrow next to closed caption and choose Show Subtitle. If you are having trouble seeing the ASL interpreters or closed captions or have any other tech issues today, please use the chat function to message all panelists and we will happily assist you. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today. Sydney Carter is the Community Engagement Coordinator at Reach Beyond Domestic Violence. Sydney works to build community connections and educate the community on domestic violence by developing a domestic violence prevention activities, actively participating in community roundtables, developing and maintaining relationships with community members and organizations, providing specialized education and training, and supporting community groups to implement prevention programs. Jaclyn Hough is the residential advocate at Reach Beyond Domestic Violence. Jaclyn believes in the power of empathy and active listening, ensuring that every individual she encounters feels heard and validated. Jaclyn recognizes that healing is a personal journey and alters her approach to meet the diverse needs of those seeking support. Jaclyn has a commitment to trauma-informed care, ensuring that her advocacy is not only compassionate, but also informed by the most current understanding of trauma and its effects. Thank you both so much for being here today, and I'll now pass it over to you for today's presentation.
Thank you, Charlotte. Hi, folks. Welcome. My name is Sydney Carter. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator at Reach Beyond Domestic Violence, and I use she, her, and hers pronouns, and I'll pass it over to my colleague to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jaclyn Hough. I am a residential advocate in our emergency shelter at Reach Beyond Domestic Violence, and I use she, her pronouns.
Thank you. So we're here to talk about housing and what it looks like to survive in a housing crisis. But before we get started, I want to tell you all a little bit about what we do over at Reach Beyond Domestic Violence. Oftentimes, if you've heard of Reach or if you've heard of Reach, we are Reach Beyond Domestic Violence. So Reach serves 27 cities and towns in the Metro West area. Here you can see the map of our service area. We're based in Waltham, but we serve all of these communities. All you have to do is live, work, or have any connection to our service area to receive our services that we offer. So all of our services are free and confidential. And our following services are a 24/7 hotline, and the number is right there on the screen. You can call this number if you're a survivor looking for support, if you're somebody who is supporting a survivor, or if maybe you've got a disclosure and you're needing some help processing what's going on. Oftentimes, our hotline is where we get a lot of our intakes for survivors in the community to come and work with our community advocates as well. We also have an emergency shelter that houses up to 8 families at a time. Guests in the shelter have a lot of resources with their advocates to work on things like housing and also safety planning and things like that. Our community advocacy program is a program that we have here at Reach that folks in the community are, the survivors in the community are placed with an advocate, and they can really do anything that the survivor needs. I always am having trouble describing what advocacy means because it's different for everyone. Oftentimes our advocates do things like going to court or helping filling out paperwork for housing, or things like figuring out things like resumes and cover letters and work permits and things like that. We also have a child and adolescent program here at Reach. We have an amazing child and adolescent therapist that works with youth that have experienced and been exposed to domestic violence. The children and adolescents that we work with here at Reach, they are internal referrals. So you have to, the parent has to be working with a community advocate in order for their child to be receiving services with our child and adolescent therapist. Our child and adolescent therapist also does things like group for the kiddos and groups with parents, along with one-on-one therapy as well. And then we also have our prevention program. So that's the team that I'm a part of. So we go out and we do things like this. And we also do tabling, and we're in many spaces and places, including police departments, healthcare facilities, schools, to teach about what is domestic violence and also how to support folks that are going through it as well. Here's a brief agenda of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to review what domestic violence is and the impacts of trauma. We're also going to review domestic violence shelter and navigating options for housing. And we're going to review safety planning, so defining what safety planning is and also getting into it and some tools. And our goals for folks to, once we're done and we wrap up and folks are going back into whether it's work or our day-to-day lives, we want folks to be able to understand the correlation between housing and domestic violence, gain tools to help with safety planning, and understand why survivors will often prioritize safety, security over safety. Before we really get into the big content piece of this presentation, it's really important that we're taking notice to how we're feeling throughout this conversation. So it's a deep topic, and oftentimes when we're talking about domestic violence, things can come up for us. So taking notice to how you're feeling. Am I feeling energized, exhausted, hungry? Are my thoughts drifting, racing, standing still? Can I feel my feet on the floor? Am I cold? Am I hot? Am I sweaty? Do I need to move my body, draw, write? I'm a big fan of fidget toys. Everywhere I go, I have them, right? Am I breathing? Can I slow down? Can I take a break? Who can I talk to about this afterwards? Again, folks, please feel free to always call our hotline at any time. It's 24/7. That's one place that folks can receive support after this. If it's like, I'm not sure where to turn to, I don't know who to talk to about this, please feel free to use our hotline. I think it's really, really important when we're talking about domestic violence is to define what is trauma. And so trauma is a profound and meaningful loss of control over an experience. And trauma can look different for everybody. There can be 2 siblings that go through the same experience, but one sibling has been affected by it a lot more than the other. So when we think about trauma, we can think about COVID-19, the pandemic that was traumatic, domestic violence, sexual assault, houselessness, divorce, national disaster, vicarious trauma, and also racism, homophobia, sexism, any type of oppression is a form of trauma. It's also important to talk about the impacts of trauma. Trauma impacts us in so many different ways in the ways that we show up. But it's also really important when talking about trauma and domestic violence is understanding that trauma is the foundation of fully understanding what is domestic violence. Domestic violence is a type of trauma that's very complex. Once we're able to understand how domestic violence impacts us and how trauma impacts us, we're able to understand domestic violence and maybe some of the survivors' behaviors. We all experience trauma and it affects us, it affects how we show up. And again, it affects us all differently. So think about maybe a random outburst from a friend that maybe you weren't expecting or you didn't think you deserved. How we treat people, how we work, how we normally function is disrupted when we're in the middle of a traumatic experience or we're in the middle of healing from one as well. When we're in the face of trauma, we go into survival mode. So this is no different than how our body functions on our day-to-day. Survival mode is just heightened feelings and emotions and behaviors. Our bodies tune into our normal behaviors and reactions in order to protect our bodies. Oftentimes when we're talking about survival mode, you'll hear the words fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And if we don't go through the motions of feeling our feelings, the healing process will be interrupted, causing us to relive fears for however long after the event. So if we're not able to move through the motions and feel what we need to feel in the moment, it can cause us to get kind of stuck and have a disruption in our healing process and cause us to relive a lot of the experiences that we have just gone through. We might not be able to feel our feelings. And this is really important when we're talking about healing. In order to feel our feelings, we want to make sure that we're in a space that we can do so. So oftentimes folks can't feel their feelings because of location or safety or social appropriateness. So is it safe for me to cry if I need to cry right now? Is it appropriate for me to scream if I feel like I need to scream in the moment? Thinking a lot about what stops us from feeling our feelings and how can we overcome that and find space where we feel safe to do so. So now that we've talked about trauma, and I've probably used the word abuse a whole bunch of times throughout this presentation, it's really important that we define what that means. So at Reach, we use the definition: abuse is a pattern of behaviors that one person uses to gain and maintain power and control over another person. When we're looking at this definition, it's really important to emphasize two key parts. The first one is pattern of behaviors. This is not a one-time incident. It's repeated over a period of time. And it's also important to note that these behaviors might not be the same exact behaviors that we've been seeing. So maybe one day it's the form of abuse is showing in a completely different way, but it's still a pattern of abuse that's happening. The second part to emphasize that's really important here is the gain and maintain power and control over another person. This is that why we might be wondering when we see or interact with people who engage in abusive behaviors. As an abuser's world gets bigger, they are able to have more resources, more connection, more community. And as a survivor's world gets smaller during this time with more isolation, less connection, and less community. So now we're going to talk about some of the types of abuse that we might see. And all these forms of abuse, Reach acknowledges here with the survivors that we work with, along with a lot of domestic violence organizations within the state. So starting off with physical. I don't start with physical because it's the most important form of abuse. I start with physical because it's the one that we kind of all know. It's the one that we see in the media, the one that we read about when we're looking at news and on social media. And it's the first one that most folks tend to think about. So physical abuse is anything that makes you feel fear for your physical safety. This can be slapping, punching, driving recklessly, and things like taking medicine away or stopping folks from receiving the medical care that they need. Then moving down to emotional and psychological abuse. That's that belittling, gaslighting. Also here we can see threats of suicide, threats to harm friends, family, loved ones, pets, and children as well. And then there's financial abuse. So this can look like withholding a survivor's income, giving an allowance that's fixed, ruining someone's credit, not allowing them to work. And another form of financial abuse that we see a lot of is, legislative abuse. So using the judicial system to file these false claims to cause somebody to miss out on work and lose money and have to find childcare, and really just is taking a lot of time, money, effort, and all of these things away from a survivor, that all things that survivors need in order to go through with their healing and safety planning and all of the things as well. And then we see sexual abuse. And oftentimes folks might link sexual and physical abuse together, but it's really important to note that there's also forms of sexual abuse that are not necessarily physical. So when we think of sexual abuse, think of any sexual act without consent. So this could be rape, not disclosing STIs, forced pregnancy. And one of the forms that we might see that is not necessarily physical could be that sharing of naked images or videos, often known as revenge porn. And then there's spiritual, cultural, and identity abuse. This one is really important because it's that weaponizing your identities to gain that power. This can look like if it's somebody in the queer community outing you. For folks that are religious, it could be stopping you from engaging in religious practices. And it can also look like taking important documents like birth certificates. And the last one is technological. Now, this one is really tricky because it's always evolving. As we know, there's always a new update on our computers and our phones, and there's always new technology coming out. So technological abuse can look like cyber stalking. It could look like using things like air tags to track your location. It can also look like monitoring your technology use. Oftentimes, technological abuse can seem as normalized, especially with younger folks. So thinking about sharing locations, thinking about the reason I'm sharing a location is for you to make sure that I'm safe. And that could be told to a survivor, but that might not necessarily be the case. So after looking at all these forms of abuse, I think it's important to sit back and kind of think about the Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 209A, which is the abuse prevention law, which restraining orders fall under in Massachusetts. So looking at this slide, it's a lot going on. And it's important to note that you have to meet this standard to receive support from the state. Just looking at this slide is extremely overwhelming. It's a lot of words, a whole lot of legal jargon. It becomes even more overwhelming when we're in the face of trauma. Again, just looking at the amount of words can cause somebody to be like, I'm not reading that at all. Also can become a barrier for folks that English isn't their first language, right? Thinking, I don't I'm not fully understanding what's going on here, especially with the complexity of legal wording. And also more of a barrier for folks that maybe didn't have a choice to get an education. So as we're looking at this definition, we can see that this definition has many, many barriers. And one of them can be that if you're looking over this, you'll notice that physical and sexual abuse are the only forms of abuse that are acknowledged in the Chapter 209A Abuse Prevention Order. Think about that being a whole barrier, about folks who are, receiving support from places like REACH or other domestic violence organizations over the state that do acknowledge all of the other forms we just talked about. And now going to the state and realizing that maybe the abuse that they're experiencing is not considered abuse to the state. And they will not be able to receive that support. So thinking about too is when we're going to court, we're thinking of how do we prove that abuse is happening to me? Very difficult, right? A lot of survivors don't know that they should be documenting their abuse that they're enduring. And also, how can they? How many can actually be documenting the abuse they're going through in a safe way? The definition also has considerations for who folks consider a family or household member. That can be depending on a judge's discretion. So there's a lot of fluctuation here depending on who you're seeing. So in the definition, it says that these are some of the considerations: the length of time of the relationship, the type of relationship, the frequency of interaction between the parties, and if the relationship has been terminated by either person, the length of time elapsed since termination of the relationship. All of this, the abuse prevention order and the words, all of these are barriers to survivors in Massachusetts. I think it's really important that after looking at that slide and learning a little bit about the forms of abuse, that most organizations acknowledge that everyone deserves the support they need. And by support, I mean equitable, empathic, and helpful. We need equity to acknowledge the many different experiences that people go through based off of their identities. Empathy that is not conditional, but for all, and helpful in a way that someone needs rather than how others see is best fit for them. And now we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on, right? So what are we trying to do? It's trying to survive in a housing crisis. So what's really important here is to understand that access to affordable housing is crucial for survivors. Survivors need safe and affordable housing to obtain security and stability. So most folks need an address for things like applying to jobs or registering kiddos in school. All of these things are really important for survivors to be able to leave abusive relationships, and some that even stay in them as well. So Massachusetts is currently in a state of emergency because of housing shortages. And according to the state, a state of emergency can be declared by the governor of Massachusetts in the event of imminent threat of natural or man-made disaster. So declaring a state of emergency is an action done to protect Massachusetts residents by providing shelter. So the state's efforts right now are looking like connecting families with permanent housing and work training. And this can get a little complicated. So the state's not going to necessarily be able to accommodate for more than 7,500 families, which is about 24,000 individuals. It's a lot of people, but not enough, right? And they've likely hit this number by the end of this month. And I think it was October 16th, there was 7,000 families that have been in emergency shelter, including pregnant women and children. and migrant families, as well as longtime Massachusetts residents. It's also important to note here that about half, 50% of individuals in emergency housing are children. And today is October 26, 2023. Shelter capacity crisis was declared on August 8th, 2023, and still pending to this day. That's a very long time for folks that don't have access to housing. So these are really big numbers, as you can see. Over 184,000 people on a wait list for the state's 41,500 subsidized housing. I'm going to let that sit just for a second. It's a lot of folks that are on a list to gain housing that have probably been on the list for a very long time. It seems as if the problem is growing and housing is just becoming less and less affordable, which is affecting everybody, but especially survivors. I think it's also important to note that when we're talking about surviving in a housing crisis, it's also important to talk about folks' identities that they hold. Oftentimes, folks' identities can reduce their chances of obtaining housing. So identities that you hold are going to make it harder. People of color, Black people, English second language, folks with no credit score, these oppressive policies in place cause barriers for folks to find housing. And it could be affordable housing, but also folks that can afford to privately rent as well. So as we move forward, you're going to hear us a lot say houseless and houselessness. I just want to address why we say houseless opposed to homeless. So we say houseless because when we think about home, it's more of that feeling. A home can move with you where you go. It's kind of that thing that's in your heart that you feel. And a house is just a building that folks create a home in. So there's many folks that don't necessarily have a house that do have a home. So home can look like many different things to many different people. And that feeling can be transferable from a building that one person owns to, a car that maybe somebody is living in, somewhere that some folks feel safe and welcomed and belonged. So an individual who is houseless is considered somebody who doesn't have or lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So this is looking like folks that live in emergency shelter or transitional housing, friends, folks living in friends or family homes, places not meant for habitation, like cars, right? So oftentimes when we think of folks that are houseless, the first thing we think of are folks that live on the street, folks that are living in tents in the city, right? This is not necessarily the case. A lot of our houseless population are folks that are living in cars and living on folks' couches or in shelter. So it's really important that as we go through, we kind of take note to what are we considering houseless. So now we're going to talk a little bit about houselessness and domestic violence. Impacts of domestic violence and trauma may force folks into houselessness. So we're going to go through this list and some more. Starting with safety concerns. Folks might end up houseless due to concerns for their safety, and they might need to suddenly relocate. Maybe it's I'm not sure, I don't have a place to turn to and I have to just get out. And folks can end up houseless that way. It can also be a lack of connection. So due to how isolating domestic violence is, it can cause folks to have nowhere to turn when they do need to leave. Again, leaving them houseless. Lack of awareness to resources. So again, due to isolation and also impacts of gaslighting, right? folks might not know that there are resources for them to help assist them with things like safety planning and housing and legal support as well. I think it's really important here when we're talking about housing and shelter that there are civil rights protections for folks, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people's personal biases don't get in the way of creating barriers for survivors. So sometimes it could be harder for folks that are male identified, queer folks, folks that have children or pets or disability to get housing because of some folks' personal biases. Also, oppressive policies. Survivors are being denied housing, right? Or evicted due to violence being committed towards them. It's kind of like when I say that out loud, it's like, what? How could you punish somebody for just existing in a world that they're existing in, right? But it happens. And as we know, it's illegal to discriminate because of race, color, religion, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, familial status, or nationality. And somehow it still happens, right? So discrimination in housing can look like refusal to rent or sell housing. Could look like refusing to negotiate for housing, making housing unavailable for folks based off of their identities, and setting different terms for folks based off of their identities. So even though all of that discrimination is illegal, landlords can still reject your application after finding out you are in an abusive relationship. They're still able to evict you due to crime-free ordinances that allow landlords to evict survivors for calling the police to get protection for them. Yes, calling the police for getting protection for them. Landlords are also able to evict you because some landlords might consider the abuse a survivor is enduring to be dangerous to other tenants. All of this is super conflicting and super hard to digest. Just the idea that there are laws in place to protect folks, but there's ways to easily get around it. It's also important when we're looking at the slide to think about folks that do end up houseless and what that could look like for them. So oftentimes when folks leave an abusive relationship and become houseless, there's a chance that they'll end up back in an abusive relationship with folks in order to get necessities, right? We're thinking about food, shelter, access to technology and gifts like clothes and shoes and any type of hygiene products. It's also important to note here that there are a lot of youth that are houseless as well. And within the first 24 hours of a youth being houseless, they're approached by an exploiter. So this can look like, we think right away it's somebody on the street, right? But this could be somebody in agencies that are there to support the youth in particular. These are really hard things to digest, right? Folks that are escaping or leaving abusive relationships and then ending up back in one in order to have the needs that everybody else has. There's another thing that I think is really important to talk about here too, is that when we're talking about folks that are houseless, and we're talking about youth in particular that are houseless, queer youth are the most people houseless. So 28% of queer youth experience houselessness. 16% of them left their caregivers due to abuse or fear of abuse due to their identity. And 14% were all kicked out because of, or abandoned, right? Because of their identities. That's a lot to process. Those are really, really big numbers for a small population of folks. So also queer folks, queer houseless youth in particular, are three times more likely to experience abuse. It when folks are houseless, when folks don't have resources, when folks don't have connections, their chances of being in abusive relationships heightens. So it's really important that, as advocates, that we are doing what we can to try to survive in this housing crisis and try to support the best that we can. Survivors do not create barriers. The oppressive systems in place do. So this is something that we really want folks to take home after this, is survivors can't control what is happening, right? Again, going back to that definition that we reviewed earlier together, gain and maintain power and control over another person. Survivors oftentimes don't have that power, don't have that control. And there are systems in place that are keeping them in abusive relationships and also just not being able to support folks that actually need the support a lot. So it's really important that when we're talking to survivors, again, this is that concept of seeing people as people and not problems. The survivors are not the problem, but the systems in place that have oppressive roots are.
So, what is an emergency domestic violence shelter? Domestic violence emergency shelters services are temporary placements for survivors of domestic violence who feel that they are at risk of violence or abuse. Emergency shelters have a range of services and activities that are designed to support individuals' needs, their families' needs, and their social needs. And that is for the survivor of domestic violence and their children. These shelters are confidential locations to keep survivors safe. When entering a shelter, clients will sign off stating that they will not disclose the location of the shelter for their safety and others living in the home as well. Some domestic violence shelters are different, but mostly they are similar, with the idea that everyone is going to get a bedroom and a safe space for themselves and their family to share for their families. And common spaces are going to be shared, the kitchen, bathrooms, and living spaces. So, advocacy. When someone is in our emergency shelter, we are providing advocacy for them. This is promoting access to community services while respecting that survivors make their own life decisions. And we're really basing it on their individual readiness. This is sharing resources and building skills that allow survivors to access community resources. We're really matching the needs of the survivor. So to start, this may look like any basic need. So that's finding clothing, food, or providing gift cards for food, having a stable environment like a bedroom with bed sheets, toiletries. These are all done when the survivor has moved into the shelter, but also as the survivor grows in our program, still meeting them with that basic needs support. While someone is living in our shelter, we are working on housing, that tough housing search that we are talking about today, right? We are educating survivors with the complexity of housing, having them understand what their options are. That may be public housing, subsidy, private housing, obtaining a Section 8 voucher, working with survivors of what this housing process may look like. And right, it's not pretty. Helping them with housing applications and navigating those extensive, repetitive applications being sent off to all these different places. Employment, right? We're helping determine survivors' career goals. We're looking for those jobs. We're writing cover letters, updating resumes, helping with connections of career coaches, using those resources in the community, doing mock interviews, right? going back and forth, having those conversations, what questions may come up, right? Getting survivors clothing for their job as well too, that fits, they may be going to construction, you need that hard hat and that vest, or you may be going to work in office, you need some heels, right? So a tie, right? So really navigating what employment can look like. Education, finding classes and courses that survivors are interested in. This may be getting a GED or starting higher education. This can be getting a survivor's kiddos enrolled into the school system. Tough to navigate, you just relocated, right? And you don't know this area, never mind the school systems, right? Doing domestic violence prevention work with survivors, using a trauma-informed framework through support groups and programming. They're in a house, they all have something in common, right? Finding support in each other, but having a space to have those conversations. The court system, we went back to that 209A prevention order. It's long, it's extensive, right? It's tough to navigate. It can be a long, lengthy process, like we talked about. The big words, it's not making sense overall. So supporting the survivor with that might just be sitting with them along in the courtroom, right? Their abuser might be there, but court advocacy can be to the extension of custody agreements, divorce, housing, right? Immigration, and more. We were just talking about immigration, the support with those extensive forms. You may need to help with translations. This can help with getting the correct documentation, again, the long, lengthy documentation, and getting in contact with an attorney to best support that survivor. So how do you get into a domestic violence shelter? It's hard, right? There isn't a lot of options, but calling SafeLink. SafeLink is a number that you can call that will give you every bed in Massachusetts that is open. They will be able to direct you to the shelter if there is an opening that fits your family's needs. DV agencies update to SafeLink if there is any opening, and encouraging survivors to call often with more accurate updates. Spaces can be filled very quickly, right? Calling those domestic violence agencies individually to hear from them directly. They may be able to give you more agency-based supports and resources in your community. And working with a community advocate through a DV program, how can we keep you safe and survivors safe, right? If shelter isn't the option. And community advocates may have a better understanding when space may open up in their shelters. A survivor will be able to build a rapport with an agency, and it will allow them to get familiar with the community. Advocates also can be in communication with other agencies about spaces opening up. Great. So we have why may shelter not work, right? The state of this world, right? Resources are limited and not everyone is aware of the resources that are available. There isn't a lot of domestic violence beds and shelters that are available. Oftentimes, survivors are finding out that a bed was open once the space has already been filled. There may be open spaces that can serve a single survivor, and the survivor who's looking for shelter has 2 children that also need that space. Although it is your civil right to not be discriminated against, we understand that there still may be personal bias that may impact or may be harder for those who identify as male or queer individuals. Again, if you have a disability, it is our hope that a survivor is not being discriminated against. A shelter may not have that accommodation to fit the needs of the survivor. For an example, this may be a room is available on the 3rd floor, right? And the survivor is unable to make it up the stairs. No other survivor is able to switch the room already on that 1st floor for easy accessibility, right? Because that accommodation has already been made for them. A survivor may not want to relocate due to the far distance of a shelter opening, right? A survivor may have to move 3 hours away, and their only support that they have is where they are. And that is just something that they don't feel they can give up, right? Another example goes for, you have a job, right? A survivor has a job with a good and stable income. That is something that is important to them. Or a child's school where accommodations have already been arranged and the child feels comfortable where they're at. And that's just something that you want to keep consistent and stable for them. And moving 3 hours away, 2 hours away, right, is just not going to fit those needs. That brings up us to trade-offs, right? So those are some examples of trade-offs. You're relocating for shelter and have to give those things up. So there are many other types of shelters than just domestic violence shelters. These other types of programs may not have the full care or support that someone may need. Oftentimes, when we are finding safety at a shelter, they specialize in other expertise, for example, substance abuse, mental health, or it could be specializing in housing for shelter for women, veterans, LGBTQ plus folks, right? They have to give up a part of their identities for that program and what that specialized program is focusing on with them. This can push back the needs of their survivor and the support of those survivors, right? An example is a survivor is in a substance abuse shelter. The reason why that person was using was because they were coping with that trauma and issues that they were facing with their abuser. But what's happening is the survivor is taking on the expertise and the support and not focusing on the root cause of the trauma, right? Great, they're getting the help that they need, right? But they are giving up that piece of identity that they do hold. That is the trade-off. And right, like DV shelters and sober houses are going to be run very differently, right? And yeah, just talking about the simplicity of, you know, relocating, right? It's really difficult. So what is a safety plan, right? We're talking about how can we be safe in surviving with housing. Individualized plan is a safety plan that is developed to increase safety, well-being, and to reduce harm. A safety plan can include strategies to maintain basic human needs such as income, housing, healthcare, food, childcare, just a sense of belonging and connection, right? Safety is not always going to look the same for everyone. What may be safe for someone is not safe for someone else. People may have different definitions of what safety means to them. Overall, with the safety plan, we're trying to build resiliency and lower the risks of harm. But with that being said, a safety plan does not guarantee safety. Keeping in mind, there are a lot of folks that have never experienced safety, but in the next few slides, we're going to dive deep into safety planning. So some examples of safety planning, we have a lot of practice, right? We safety plan in our everyday lives just to stay safe. Sometimes safety planning can be as simple, and other times safety planning can require a lot more thought and attention. We safety plan walking to our car late at night. This may be by having a friend walking with you to the car, or going on a blind date. This could be sharing your location with a trusted friend, right? And having them check on you. For many folks, right, the safety planning process starts the moment that they wake up in the morning. Some examples of safety planning come easy. We've learned since we were little in schools, what does it look like for a fire drill? We are learning to navigate COVID-19 protocols, baby proofing, lifeguarding, airbags, and seatbelts are other forms of safety planning as well. So we're going to dive deep into the VIGOR tool. This tool stands for Victim Inventory of Goals, Options, and Risks. It is one of the many tools that can be used to do an in-depth safety plan for coping with violence and other problems. It also can be used multiple times as situations do change. Starting off with identifying goals. Start by asking the survivor, where would you like to be 6 months from now, 1 year from now? Do you have hopes for yourself, your family? What are those goals, right? This is when a survivor is going to go and they're going to list their goals. Some goals can include leaving the abuser, finding stable housing, how to navigate a safe custody transfer, how to co-parent safely, right? Next steps would be to identify those risks. This is where the survivor should think about the current problems that they are dealing with. The survivor will plan out and describe what the actual risks and possible risks may happen. Risk categories can include personal safety, right? That may be physical, verbal, sexual safety, and well-being. For example, a possible risk may be a survivor is trying to leave the home after a fight has escalated and abuser is blocking the entrance. Another risk may be other safety and well-being, children, family, pets. We've seen pets a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic, not wanting to leave those pets, right? Friends or others. Financial risks, money issues related to work, school, moving, those legal fees, right? Bills and more. Social risks, ways that your relationships with friends and families might be affected. Do coworkers know what's going on? Is it safe to let people know in your life what is going on? Psychological risks, like feeling like you might not have control over your situation, emotional risks like stress, depression. After assessing these risks and going into more detail on those risks, the survivor should list the biggest and most important risks that do come up for them. So navigating, what are our strengths? What are our resources? Sometimes we may feel like there are no strengths, there's resources, but that's why in the Vigor tool, we break down, right? Personally and psychologically, ways that you're strong and that you can keep yourself safe. That can include all types of strengths, courage, and faith. Housing resources, so access to a safe place to live. That may be your own home, name on a lease, right? Affordable housing. Financial resources may be sources of income or other financial supports. Legal resources is having that documentation, getting legal help, other things that can help you deal with courts and agencies. Social and community resources are people that you can rely on in times of trouble, and that can include family, that can be AA groups or other state-provided programs, religious groups or other organizations. And privacy and protection, the ability to increase privacy settings on your phone, your computer, or to make your home feel a little more secure for you. So once we've identified our risks, those resources, we're going to identify what these options are. So they can be used together, separately, but navigating what are those housing options. It may be staying with a friend, renting an apartment, or going to a shelter, staying with a partner, having funds for a hotel or a motel. Financial options include opening a bank account, maybe a separate bank account from your abuser if they're shared together. Getting job training, applying for a job, start saving. You could even borrow some money, right? That may be an option for some people. Legal options, applying for orders of protection, restraining orders, filing for divorce, to seek full custody of children. Some social options can include joining community groups, talk, support groups, therapies. Psychological options can be joining support groups, individuals, exercising, journaling, finding ways to do self-care through all of this madness, right? What can feel like madness. Privacy and protection, that can be changing locks, changing phone numbers or passwords, getting a prepaid phone, a phone that the abuser doesn't know about. So then we're going to reflect on the choices and weighing out these options. When reflecting, the survivor is going to list the biggest or most important risks that they do have. They're going to break it down, the risks, by answering some following questions of, what can you do? What is this going to help with? What does this not help with? Do I need anything right now in order to do this? And how can I get what I do need, right? They're going to continue to ask themselves these questions. And after having a plan, this will construct what the plan and what they can do. So for example, we have a survivor who is nervous about how to be safe when a fight has become escalated, or concerned on how to leave the house in a safe way. One thing they can do here is place the car keys by an exit door, right? So breaking down those questions we're asking ourselves. This choice may be able to help because the keys are closest, and in a way closest to the fastest exit for that survivor. This may not help because the survivor may be blocking that exit door for them to leave, right? So do I need anything right now in order to do this? Is there a spare set of keys we can put somewhere? Can we talk through it with a friend, right? That's when that option may not work out for that survivor, right? So navigating another option, it may work out, but just having that safety plan to look at other options as well here too. So is the survivor able to pack a bag with needed belongings if they don't feel they can return from that escalated incident? This may be helping by having all the needed documentation, a change of clothes if needed, some money put away, spare, maybe some cash in that bag. If kiddos are coming, do we have a toy for that kid to keep that kid occupied for that time, right? Of kind of really leaving and finding that safe place to go. This may not help if the abuser finds that bag with all that personal belongings in that one place together. But do I need anything? Is there things that I can do? Is there resources that can better help this option? Well, can we make copies of the documentation? Can we talk with a friend, a family member that can hold on to this bag for you? Planning that safe word if something was to escalate, can we reach out to a friend or a family member that knows that code word and what those options are? Remembering to remind survivors, and while survivors are doing this safety plan, that they can change their choices later. Things may come up while you're in that incidents that we're not sure about, right? But changing the choices later as they go along. Overall, we understand that some problems are out of a person's control, like abusive partner's behavior that's out of a survivor's control. Our hope is by using this tool and creating a safety plan, we are going to make the survivor feel more comfortable, more supported, and being prepared, trying to ease that anxiety while you're in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. Some reminders. No safety plan is going to have that one size fits all approach. There are multiple approaches that can be taken that will best support the needs of the survivor. Shelters are very full and they can't be relied on for that sole safety option. Safety planning is never finished. It's always changing. For providers, to make sure you're taking the lead of the survivor's approach, right? We're working in a survivor-driven approach. Going back to the definition and reviewing advocacy, providers are serving the survivors where they're at. Survivors are the experts in their own lives. They know how these situations may play out, really just following the lead of the survivors. Some things to consider when we are safety planning, and we've talked a little bit about them, but just to compile them all together, right? Employment-related concerns. Are you feeling comfortable or safe to share with your job what you're dealing with? Are you worried that your abuser may come to your place of work? Child and family needs. What does navigating co-parenting with your abuser look like? Gathering what is needed, right, for kiddos to be safe in the few days or maybe a few months, right? The wave of abuse. Leaving is the most dangerous time for survivor. They may not want to leave because they are nervous. The wave of abuse, we go down, we're up, right? Folks may not want to leave their relationships because they're at that good point. The abuser has manipulated to make it feel like it's good right now, right? Holidays and anniversaries. Thinking about the holidays, they're supposed to be family time, and you don't want to be the one to break off that relationship at that time for the kids or for the family, right? We go back to family and friends may not be knowing. Thinking about the holiday time and religion. Will the abuser allow the survivor to practice their religion? Is it safe to leave with the kids to go celebrate with your family? We talked a little bit about code words, sharing with family and friends, a child, right? What is a code word if something may happen? Creating a plan based on the code word. This word may mean meeting at a certain place. This word may mean to call the police. High risk factors can include folks who are involved with the police, DCF cases, threats of calling DCF and getting kiddos taken away, immigration can all be high risk factors. The importance of having documentation put together, social security cards, identifications, passports, birth certificates, compiled when, if you're in shelter to get housing, right? If you need to relocate, to have those personal documentations together for yourself, or at least a plan in place if you need to get them. How can someone support you in getting those documentations? Finances. Does the survivor have cash to put away in case of an emergency? Does the abuser have access to shared bank accounts? And looking at the transaction history to find their location. We talked a little bit about technological usage and online trails. Does the abuser have their location? Are you able to turn off the location? Basic needs like toiletries packed away, bank cards, clothes, right? Just in case those are needed. Support networks. Are you working with a DV agency? Are you able to call an emergency hotline if something happens, or you just have a question, right? What are support networks in your life? It may not be as big as a DV agency. That could be a family, friend, coworker, right? Medical and mental health considerations. Do you have medications that you need to be taking? Do you have your doctor's contact information? Insurance. Do you hold insurance? Does your abuser hold the insurance? Are we going to be able to have access to medical and mental health considerations, right? And lastly, transportation. How is a survivor going to get from one place to the other? If there is a car, is the car in the abuser's name, or do they hold the insurance? That can be a concern down the line. So navigating what transportation ways are possible. So sometimes we can feel like there is no option. Talking through situations and planning, even if survivors don't have the clear idea of options, can be helpful, right? Going to stay with a family and friend, right? We've talked about this may mean relocating. Is there an amount of time that you can stay with one family member and then move to another friend's house and maybe another family's member's house? So maybe moving around while things settle down, right? Hospitals. If there are medical needs, survivors may be able to find support with working with the social worker and a hospital to get in contact with resources. Hospitals have safe beds. These safe beds were a lot more accessible pre-COVID, but they may be an option if available. Other types of shelters, right? We've talked about trade-offs, but there may be a space and basic needs can be met, but also thinking, right, how a survivor may need to give up a piece of their identity, but they might just need that safe space for themselves and get those basic needs at that time. Motels, if a survivor has a funds or can get in contact with an agency that can best support them, that may be staying for a few days or a week maybe, right? Police, right? Police are not a safe resource for everybody, but they may be able to help in emergency situations. And last on the list, we have airports, trains, bus stations. Again, this may not be the safest option, but airports are open 24 hours. These places are lit and they may often have people around.
Great. Thank you, Jaclyn. Now we're kind of going to talk a little bit about some choices that are really, really hard. So choosing between safety and security is a hard decision that survivors that are planning on leaving their relationship often think about, right? I think it's also really important here. We've been talking about a lot of folks that are looking for shelter after leaving, but it's also important to emphasize that there are folks that are looking for shelter that are planning on staying in their relationship. Folks stay in relationships for many reasons, and security is one and love is another. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what is security. So security is that state of feeling secure, and this could be with housing, income, food, security for education and for children and for yourself, security for an address to have on that job application and papers and such like that. And what is safety? So safety is that condition of being protected from danger, risk, or injury. So when we're thinking about the two things, we might say safety is more important to us. But again, like Jaclyn said, survivors are the experts of their own lives and they know what's best for them at all points. Choosing safety can be super unpredictable for survivors. Can be really dangerous. Again, like Jaclyn said, if folks are leaving a relationship and choosing that safety piece, that's the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship. So choosing safety can provide some type of unpredictability. So when we're living with our abuser, we're getting used to their routine. We're getting used to our routine, what we can do to stop maybe certain forms of abuse from happening to us in a moment, right? I know that by the way my partner shuts the door when they get home, that something's going to happen. But I know that if I have dinner on the table before they reach me, that nothing is going to happen, right? So oftentimes survivors have these ideas and behaviors that help them, right? So when we're completely removing ourselves from a home that there's an abuser in, we might not know what their routine is. Their routine might change. We might not know what the abuser is doing, where they might be, and that can cause us to feel even more heightened sense of fear, right? And also could be unpredictable for trying to figure out where to live, right? Again, like we've talked about this whole time, we're living in a really hard time. We're in the middle of a housing crisis, and there are folks that need and deserve support that are not receiving it. And I'm talking about survivors, but I'm also talking about a lot of folks within the state, and I should say the United States, right? So choosing safety might mean that, again, I don't have a place to live. I don't know how I'm going to afford food or find support. And also, it's really important to notice here that choosing safety doesn't necessarily mean that the abuse is going to stop. So like I was just talking about a little bit, that unpredictability of not knowing what and where your survivor, where the abuser is, right? It's a misconception that leaving an abusive relationship, choosing that safety will actually stop the abuse from happening. In some cases, it might make it worse. So oftentimes we see survivors choosing that security over that safety piece. Survivors know what's best for them, and having a roof over your head, maybe having a little income, having food, being able to provide for children. A lot of folks think about, raising children in a 2-parent home and things like that might want them to stay in an abusive relationship opposed to or an abusive household rather than finding new places to live or leaving their relationship, because the pros of security outweigh the pros of of safety. And as we talked about kind of throughout this whole presentation, it's really, really, really important to emphasize here that survivors are the experts of their own lives. So we have talked about this a lot, right? Just like I'm the expert of my life and you are all the experts of your lives, survivors are the experts of their lives. So whether we're an advocate or we're somebody just supporting a loved one that is going through an abusive relationship, it's really important that we center their needs and follow their lead. So something a little bit about me is I'm a natural born fixer. So in the past, my friends would come with me with things, and the first thing I would do would be like, oh, okay, like I can figure it out. I'll go do this, and that, and everything will be all set, right? And oftentimes my friends were like, why would you do that? I didn't ask you to do that. That actually made it worse for me. It's the idea of it's really hard for us to help people in the way that they need versus the way that we see fit. So it's providing that support for folks in the way that they express that they need. Because oftentimes I think too is a lot of us come to this work for many reasons, especially advocates and folks that work in domestic violence prevention and all of the various fields of domestic violence. The domestic violence field, a lot of us come to this field because we are survivors ourselves. A lot of us have experiences ourselves that we see the survivors we're working with going through, and we might think, oh my gosh, when I was going through this, that this like certain application for housing was really helpful for me, so I'll just go ahead and do that for them. It's okay to present those options opposed to making those decisions for folks, because what was helpful for you might not be necessarily helpful for them. So as we move forward, the importance of connection, we are all in this together. So for survivors, different domestic violence agencies may have a different approach that will fit your specific needs. And for providers, this work is really challenging. But if we're able to work together and collaborate and support one another, we will be able to achieve our common goal of ending domestic violence. We can't end domestic violence alone. For a second, I want folks to just kind of think and reflect about a world where if you're an advocate, where your job doesn't exist because all the relationships are healthy, because we're not needed. As a preventionist, I dream about this world. I talk about this a lot, of the concept of working ourselves out of a job. I'd like folks to take a second to reflect on what a world would look like without domestic violence and intimate partner violence. What we will be doing instead of the work that we're doing now. How will folks be better served for their needs? What a world filled with empathy, compassion, and comprehensive care will look like. And when asking all those questions, again, I use will, because in order to do this work, we need to believe that change is possible. Survivors and providers, we know that there is an overlap. We hope that you feel heard, validated, without blame, shame, and empowered. And for providers, what we do with our power matters. So we have the ability to go into many spaces and places that some folks might not be able to. We have that power, and how we use it matters, and what we do with it matters a lot. We have the power, again, to get into those spaces and places to change and places of change and challenge, right? Certain things. We have the ability to amplify, uplift, and center the voices of folks that need to be heard the most. This is one of the things that we tend to end with in most of outreach with most of our presentations, is thinking a little bit about how we care for ourselves. So One of the things I like to think a lot about is when we get on a plane and they're doing all of the safety planning, right? The telling us where the air mask will deploy from and where the life jackets are and where the exit rows are. One of the things they say is that in case of an emergency or in case of change in cabin pressure, be sure to place the resulting oxygen mask over your own face before assisting anyone else, even your own children. This can be really hard for some of us to digest, especially folks that are like, all I want to do is help others and I will put myself behind others. But they say it for a reason. So let's talk a little bit about why. So taking care of ourselves is taking care of others. So what's really important here is that we're giving ourselves the same grace that we give our clients and our friends and our family. I think I talk about this concept a lot. Oftentimes my colleagues and friends and families will do something and be really hard on themselves about it. And I'm always like, it's just a mistake. Like, we're all human. Like, it's okay that we are, all we're doing is trying our best. And if I was to make the same mistake, I know that I would be equally as hard on myself as the folks that I'm supporting are. So it's really important that we're giving ourselves the same grace that we give the folks that we work with and are friends with and in love. It's also important to acknowledge and address your own overwhelm. When there's a lot coming your way, what can we do to address what's going on? How can we best be able to feel our feelings? It's also important to develop strategies and practices and policies that promote self-care. So this can look like organizations that are, having folks do like exercise classes, or they're doing like art classes, or promoting more time off, more personal days, more mental health days, allowing for folks to receive clinical supervision and get the support that they need. This could also to build practices of connection and community for yourself. So everybody needs that connection and community. Community is so important to the way that we exist in the world. We need a place where we feel like we can be our safest selves and be our bravest selves and also be our full selves without feeling any judgment. That sense of being belonging is really important to our human experience and for our mental health and how we show up every single day. So making sure we can find, that could be friends, that could be family, it could be folks online, whatever you're comfortable with. It could also be pets, right? Finding those connection and community that makes you feel good. I think also, as we're starting to wind down a little bit, it's important that we know that people come to this work, as I said, for many reasons. A lot of us in this field doing this work are survivors too. So it's really important that organizations don't stop their compassion with the survivors that they're working with, but extend it to advocates and other workers as well. We all need care to be able to support the survivors that we're working with and the communities that we're working with as best as we can. We can't become numb to be able to show up to work every day to do the work that we do. This is really, really hard work. It's crucial that we have networks of support that can give us the grace of feeling our feelings and taking care of ourselves in the way that we need. There is support for you. There are people that care. It's really important that we're taking care of ourselves, because at the end of the day, in order to do what we do, we need to make sure that we are okay. And before we take it, pass it over to some questions, I'd like to do just a quick check-in with ourselves to notice maybe some of the feelings that might have come up during this. So folks can take a moment and think about 5 things that you can see. This could be me on the screen, could be a pen, a notebook, maybe you have a water bottle. 4 things that you can feel physically. So that could be your feet on the ground. It could be maybe you're playing with a fidget. It could be the clothes lying on your skin, your tongue at the top of your mouth. Three things that you can hear. That could be my voice talking right now, the sound of a pen clicking. It could be the sound of a clock or maybe a car driving by. And 2 things that you can smell. Maybe you used a really great conditioner today or a perfume, or maybe you're working from home and there's coffee in the coffee pot, or you're at work and some folks are heating up early lunch or late breakfast. And most importantly, one thing that you're grateful for about yourself for today. Awesome. Thank you so much, folks. We'll open it up to questions.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you both, Sydney and Jaclyn, for this presentation. As we've said throughout the training, this is such an important and hot topic with the housing crisis. And so thank you for sharing not only information on housing, but also, given the crisis, other alternatives for safety planning when housing is not available. So if you do have questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A. I see a couple coming in now. And we did get a question earlier in the chat that I answered, but I just I'll verbally say it as well. We are able to share these slides with you all after this, as well as a recording of today's training. So I'll send that in an email later today, along with some other resources as well. So I think this is just a thank you. It says it's very unfortunate that the system wasn't designed to help the victim as much as it helps the abuser. And just a thank you for sharing your time and knowledge. This person was grateful to be here today and listen to the presentation. So I'm sure a lot of people feel that way. We still have a few minutes, so if anyone else has questions, definitely drop them in the Q&A. But I think Brenna is going to drop some other resources in the chat. We have a feedback form for today's session. I'll include that in the email as well. And tomorrow we have another training in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month that's more on DV 101. If you are interested in that and have not registered yet, that link is in the chat as well. But with that and not seeing any other questions, I'll just give another thank you to Sydney and Jaclyn. Their contact information as well as reaches, is in the slides. And so you'll receive a copy of that as well later today. But thank you all for joining us. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day and week. Enjoy the warm weather in Massachusetts today.
Thank you, folks. We really appreciate folks taking time out of their day to spend with us today. So thank y'all, and thank you, MOVA, for organizing this.
Bye, everyone. Take care.